Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third and final day of the 2012 Naval Academy Leadership Conference. It is my privilege to introduce the speaker this morning, Colonel Art Athens. Colonel Athens is the director of the U.S. Naval Academy's Vice Admiral James B. Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership and a member of the Academy's senior leadership team. Colonel Athens retired from the Marine Corps in July 2008 with over 30 years of combined active duty and reserve service. As a Marine officer, he commanded units in the 3rd and 4th Marine Aircraft Wings, served with U.S. Space Command, and instructed at Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1, the Marine Corps' equivalent to the Navy's Top Gun school. Additionally, he was a White House Fellow under President Ronald Reagan, the Special Assistant to NASA Administrator following the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, the Executive Director of OCF, a worldwide nonprofit organization helping military personnel integrate their faith and profession, the Commandant of the United States Merchant Marine Academy, and the Naval Academy's first Distinguished Military Professor of Leadership. Aside from his professional responsibilities, Colonel Athens has been a volunteer lacrosse coach at the high school and collegiate levels. The Washington Post recognized him as the High School Coach of the Year. Colonel Athens holds a bachelor's degree in operations research from the Naval Academy, where he lettered in lacrosse and served as the brigade commander, the senior ranking midshipman at the Academy. He also earned his master's degree from the Naval Postgraduate School and the Army School of Advanced Military Studies. He is married to former Mistina Root of Williamsburg, Virginia, and they have 10 children. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Athens.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, good morning. It is an honor and a privilege. I think that's how this conference started. Mr. Kawasaki said it was an honor and a privilege, but a lot of times when you're speaking, it really isn't. But he said it really was being here. Well, it certainly is for me as well this morning. Sarah did mention I do have 10 children, so I'm going to get your questions out right away, even before the microphone questions. Yes, they're all mine. Yes, they're all with the same wife. And yes, we know how it happens. So in case you're worried about me, and I'm very fortunate because actually my wife Misty and 3 of our children actually get to join me this morning. So my wife Misty, son Stephen, daughter Stephanie, and daughter Deborah are here. So I'm always excited to have my own fan club here joining me. I hope this has been a very valuable experience for you over the last couple of days, both from what you've learned as well as who you've met. And maybe the latter is even more important because the relationships that are established, the people that you meet, you just don't know how those intersections continue to occur through a lifetime. So I hope it's been a great conference for you. And I want to salute each one of you who sits there today for being interested and committed to leadership development. Because I'm not sure there's more an important aspect of life than taking on leadership responsibility. And you're here to get better at it. I'm here to get better at it. It's a lifelong pursuit. And when I thought about you and leadership development, I was thinking about someone that was actually mentioned in the panels yesterday, a gentleman by the name of John Gardner. John Gardner is a hero of mine, someone who has always been committed to developing young leaders. He was a Republican, yet he signed up under Lyndon Johnson to become the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He founded Common Cause, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that really looks at how government is operating, and a bit of a watchdog. But John Gardner, his greatest passion was the leadership development of young people. And I remember he once said, comparing today to a long time ago, he said in a sparsely populated set of colonies that had a population of about 2.5 million people, we were able to produce the likes of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Hamilton, Franklin, the list goes on. And then he would say, with our current population, we should have 100 times the number of those kinds of extraordinary leaders. He said, but we don't. And then he said, but we could. That's vision. And you're part of that vision. You have the opportunity to be those future Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and so many who have impacted the world. Hold that vision as you leave this place. Now, that's been the main topic for the last couple of days, is vision in uncharted waters. I'd like to tackle one aspect of vision that's been alluded to over the last couple of days. It's been modeled by some of the speakers and panelists, but we haven't directly touched on it, and I want to do that this morning. And I think it's an aspect of vision that is the key to go from vision to action, from vision to execution, from vision to victory. It's really the key. And to look at this aspect, I'd like to look at a measurement of 4 feet, 8.5 inches. 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Now, what is that? Well, what it actually is the railroad gauge in the United States. It's the distance between the 2 rails on any system anywhere in the United States. If you measured it from one rail to the other, it would be 4 feet, 8.5 inches. Sounds like an odd number. So the question is, why 4 feet, 8.5 inches? Well, the reason is because the British rail system has a gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches. And the people who built primarily the United States railway system, who supervised, were from Britain. Well, why does Britain have a 4 feet, 8.5 inch rail gauge? Well, the reason is it's because the people who built the British railway system built the tramways in England, and they were the same people who built the railway. So why is the tramway rail gauge in Britain that predecessed those railroads 4 feet, 8.5 inches? Well, the reason for that is the people who brought the tramways into existence, they used the same tools and devices that the people who built the wagons in England did. They just used the same tools, and they were already set at 4 feet, 8.5 inches, so they took the wagon makers and used that for the tramway system that then used it for the railroad system. Well, why did the wagon people do 4 feet, 8.5 inches? And the reason was you had to have a wagon that had that spread on your wheels if you were going to survive the ruts that were in the roads all over Britain and all over Europe. Well, why were there ruts that were 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide? Well, the reason is because the Romans built the road system in Europe. And they had chariots that caused those ruts to be formed over the years that eventually would lead to everything else. But why were those ruts 4 feet, 8.5 inches? And the reason was that was the width of the chariot wheels of a standard Roman chariot. But how did they get 4 feet, 8.5 inches? Well, they got that because at one point in time in history, the decision was made to make a standard chariot for the Roman Empire. And they pulled in 2 average-size war horses. They got on the backside of those horses, measured the distance, and kicked it out just a little bit because the wheels would have to be outside those horses, and that distance just happened to be 4 feet, 8.5 inches. So when you look at the railroad system of the United States, you go, why is it 4 feet, 8.5 inches? It's because of the backside of 2 war horses of the Roman Empire. Now that's a story. What does that have to do with vision? Well, it has everything to do with vision. If the vision for your unit or your organization or your school is to challenge assumptions, to think out of the box, to ask the question, well, you say we always have done it that way. Who says we have to do it that way? Now, you can develop a PowerPoint presentation that has lists of bullets, even if you use big graphics and big fonts. You can have your PowerPoint and your listing of your vision. Or you could tell that story. I guarantee you that you will never look at a railroad track again the same way, because it will be inside of your mind even if you try to put it out. If I put a PowerPoint up and say our main vision is to make sure we challenge assumptions, think out of the box, and ask the question, why do we always do it that way? You would not remember it. It's how we're wired. We're wired for stories. If we are going to make vision into action, into execution, into victory, we need to be able to tell stories. And we need to connect those stories to our vision so people can see it. So the software of the mind is programmed towards where we want people to head. I've had the good fortune of getting to know a man by the name of Jim Donald over the last 5 years. Jim Donald was the CEO of Starbucks. At the height of its growth, he was named the nation's top CEO a number of years ago. Jim Donald led by stories. And one of his vision components for Starbucks during his time was discipline with creativity. So what did Jim Donald do? Did he pull up his PowerPoint slide and say, creativity, discipline? No. No, he told stories. He'd travel about 20 out of every 30 days, every month, to go find stories in Starbucks and then relate them to the rest of the organization. One of his favorite ones was Megan's Mocha. Remember, the vision he's trying to get across to Starbucks is discipline with creativity. So he visits a Dallas Starbucks. He's the CEO. He's the main guy. But not everyone recognizes him by face, particularly the baristas who are working behind the counter. So Jim Donald walks into the Dallas Starbucks, and there's a big sign that's across where all the prices are. And it says, sale, Megan's Mocha. Now, if you've been in Starbucks, I bet you've never seen a sign like that. Starbucks are pretty standard, and they don't have sale items typically. So this was very curious to Jim Donald, who's running this big company, and he's in Dallas at one of his Starbucks, and there's a sale, Megan's Mocha. So he goes up to the barista and he says, what's that for sale? And she's very enthusiastic, and she says, oh, well, we have a sale item on our white chocolate mocha. Now, it's about April or May when this story takes place. And he says, is that right? He says, tell me a little bit about the story. And she goes, oh, well, here's what happened, is that Megan, we all love her, but around Christmas time, she ordered way too much white chocolate mocha mix, and all of a sudden we had it all left over. But then Megan was so brilliant, she came up with the idea, well, once we get into more of the spring, why don't we put it on sale? We'll have a sale and call it Megan's Mocha, because everyone seems to like me. He said, is that right? Who's the manager of this store? So she said, oh, it's Jill back there. Could I talk to Jill? Sure. Brings Jill out. The baristas didn't recognize Jim Donald, but Jill did, the manager of the store. And she comes forward, and she sees this is the CEO. Mr. Donald, it's so nice to see you in our store. And he looks up at the sign. She looks up at the sign. She's figured it's all over. So he says, tell me about what this Megan did, and I'd like to meet her. So she tells the same story. Megan is brought over, introduced to the CEO. He says, this is fantastic. Now, maybe just take the sign off the main thing and put it just to the side, but I love the creativity. Don't stop. Jim Donald walked out of that Starbucks store and called up every single one of his senior vice presidents and said, let me tell you a story about Megan's Mocha. And let me tell you what that means when it comes to discipline and creativity. And I want you to tell it to all your regional managers, and I want all your regional managers to tell it to your area managers, who will tell it to all the store managers. It's all about story. Coach Boone was up here the first day. I love the movie Remember the Titans. I didn't think there was a real person who was, but that was him. That was the real Coach Boone. That was the guy who made it happen. Do you remember the story about the blind man walking across the street with the dog? I do, because it was a story. Do you remember the story he told of Sunshine? A minute left in the game, and Sunshine comes over to tell the coach with all that experience what play he should call? What was going through your mind as he's telling the story? You're picturing Sunshine from the movie. Long blonde hair, the guy from California. You can just picture him going over there and telling the coach. And that all brings in the memory of the story. How about the North Carolina soccer coach? He has this recruit Everyone keeps trying to tell him how great she is. She's really not that great, but he decides he's going to meet with her. You remember that? How scared she was? She was trying to get as small as she could, and what's the one question he asked her? Are you a psycho? How did you remember that? It's part of a story. How many of you can regurgitate one of the PowerPoints that was up there that had about 20 listing of what leadership's all about? I'm telling you, you're not going to be able to. There's nothing wrong with having those lists, but if you want to bring that vision across, you're going to find stories that bring it across. Why is it? Why is story so powerful? Because it hits the emotion. It hits the emotion. Aristotle wrote a book called Rhetoric, and he said if you're going to persuade people, you have to have three components. The first one is ethos, the second one is logos, and the third one is pathos. Ethos, logos, and pathos. He said the ethos is your credibility, your character. You have to be believable. The second part is logos. You have to be well organized as you persuade. But the most important is pathos, the heart, the emotion. And that's what stories get at. They get at the heart. They get us involved because as we're thinking about the story as it's told, we become one of the characters, one of the actors in it, and we become involved. And as we become involved, that locks it into our brain. And we're going to remember story. People don't remember PowerPoint. People remember story. So how does this actually work in the real world when it comes to vision and execution and success? Well, I'm going to repeat something that General Droughty and General Sattler said yesterday in two different panels. Vision is not just for CEOs, admirals, and generals. It's for all of us. We live in a world that's dying for vision at every level, from lowest to highest. Give me a vision. Tell me where I'm going. And when I understand that, I'm going to join with you and go. So it is effective at all these different levels. So let me start at the top, at the strategic level, the highest level, the President of the United States. I had the good fortune of serving as a White House fellow under President Reagan. By the way, John Gardner is the person who established the White House Fellowship Program under Lyndon Johnson, to bring in young leaders, to expose them to government, to help them maybe become better leaders and become those people that could make a difference in their nation. So I'm under President Reagan. President Reagan's great vision, more than anything else, was to defeat the evil empire, as he called it, the Soviet Union. How many of you were born after 1989? What happened in 1989? The Berlin Wall falls. 1990, the Soviet Union collapses. Nobody thought that was possible when Ronald Reagan came in as President of the United States. But I'm going to tell you, Ronald Reagan didn't use PowerPoint. Well, of course, it wasn't sort of around when he first came in, but even if it was, he wouldn't have used it, because he would have used story just like he did. He used to love using imagery to help people join on with the vision. And Reagan was very good at using humor to do that. One of his favorite stories about the Russians, because he was always trying to compare the freedom of the United States, the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union. And he would use humor and story to help generate that. And when he would tell this story, he'd always get a twinkle in his eye and this ever so slight smile, because he loved telling this story. He said in the Soviet Union, only 1 of 7 families has an automobile. And for the average Russian, the wait time, once you order an automobile, is 10 years. So you sign up for an automobile, and 10 years later, you get your automobile. So he said a Russian, one of the average Russians, walks into the dealership and is going to make this commitment, fills out tons of paperwork, and then has to actually put down a lot of money. The dealer collects the paperwork and the money and says, well, in 10 years, your car will be delivered. And the Russian said, in the morning or the afternoon? And the dealer said, what difference does that make? And the Russian said to the dealer, well, the plumber is coming in the morning. He used to love that one. The other one he used to love to tell is that there's an American and a Russian debating the politics of their two countries. And the American said, well, let me tell you something. In my country, the United States, I can walk into the White House, I can go into the Oval Office, and I can bang my fist on the president's desk and say, Mr. President, I don't like the way you're running our country. The Russian says, well, I can do the same thing in my country as well. The American says, you can? The Russian says, absolutely. I can walk through Red Square, I can go into the Kremlin, go into the General Secretary's office, bang my fist on his desk and say, Mr. General Secretary, Mr. Gorbachev, I don't like the way President Reagan is running his country. He used to love those stories. And it was all part of establishing the vision. I would challenge you, when you leave and go back to your respective places, to look up on the internet President Reagan's speech at the Berlin Wall, where he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But read the rest of the speech and see how much of it is involved with story and imagery. He was great at it. He gave that speech on June 12, 1987. 2 years later, the wall would fall. And a year after that, the Soviet Union would collapse. A vision at the highest levels with story, with success at the other end. Let me tell you about a mid-level one. I took command of a Marine Corps Reserve unit. It had 2,000 Marines in it across 4 states: Pennsylvania, Virginia, Texas, and Colorado. When I showed up to that unit, it was very clear the unit looked good on the outside, but it was not a very good unit. It certainly was not combat ready. They did parades well, and they did Toys for Tots well. But they weren't ready to go to war. And I realized there was a very clear vision for this unit, and that was to mobilize, in other words, get everybody together from 4 states and get ready to go, mobilize, deploy, fight, win, and return. That was the vision. Now again, I could have put it up on a PowerPoint slide, but I didn't. I made the decision to focus our efforts on one story, and the story took place in the Korean War. Just a couple of years after the end of World War II, everyone was sitting kind of relaxed. Boy, it's good to have the world wars over. Surely not going to be anything big for a while. And then all of a sudden, on the 25th of June, 1950, North Korea invades into South Korea. The Republic of Korea Army fights valiantly but poorly, and North Korea keeps coming south. So the United States had a reaction force that was in Japan. It was part of the 24th Infantry Division. It had 540 soldiers in it, and it was commanded by a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith. It would eventually be known as Task Force Smith. They flew in Task Force Smith. They brought them to Osan, about 35 kilometers south of Seoul, and told them, hold against the North Koreans. Task Force Smith was told, as soon as the North Koreans see that there are U.S. forces involved, they'll flee and turn the other way. On the 5th of July, 1950, the North Koreans, with an armored brigade in the spearhead, began to move south towards Task Force Smith. Task Force Smith fired recoilless rifles, bazookas, at T-34 tanks that the North Koreans had, and they had absolutely no effect. They realized they had forgotten to bring anti-tank mines with them. They were ill-prepared. They were ill-trained. They had nothing up here preparing them to be ready for action. The attack by the North Koreans started at 7 in the morning. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Task Force Smith had been outflanked, decimated, and they began to retreat. I told my unit we would never be a Task Force Smith. We would be ready. And that story continued on through the 2 years that I had command. No war came up during that time. But very shortly after, that unit had to go to Afghanistan, to Iraq and fight the drug wars in Central and South America, and they were ready. Because what was ingrained in them is that we will not be a task force Smith. That's at the mid-level. What about at the entry level, where you don't have large units, you just have a couple of people? A couple of years ago, and I think it was mentioned that I've been involved with lacrosse a long time, coaching at high school, collegiate levels. Well, two of my sons were on a high school team in southern Maryland, about an hour south of here where we live. Just before the season started, about 2 weeks in fact, the head coach quit and went to another state to take a teaching position. The two assistant coaches, one decided he didn't want to be involved anymore, and the other one had a health problem. So the season is about to start, and in Maryland, lacrosse is a big deal. And you don't want to not have a high school lacrosse team and try to explain why you don't have one. So the principal and the athletic director came to me and said, hey, we know you've done a lot with lacrosse, would you take this team? So 2 days before the season began, I signed my paperwork to be the coach of this group of 28 young athletes. This was a team that was a disaster on the field and off, except for my two sons. They were okay, but the rest of the team, pretty shaky. And I realized I had very little time to get this team moving in some direction. You remember when we were asked to close our eyes yesterday and point towards north? And there were a lot of different well, that was the team. I mean, they were pointing in all kinds of directions. So I don't know if you remember the Titans. When Coach Boone comes to meet his team the first time, comes across that gym, he's well-dressed, shirt tucked in, confident, comes in, obviously in charge. So I realized, man, I got to get this going quick. So that's how I walked across that gym floor as those young men were there waiting to hear what their new coach was going to say. And I came up in front of them and I said, if you look around this gymnasium, there's no lacrosse banner. There has not been, and the only way you get a banner is to win a championship, either conference, region, or state. They all kind of looked. And I said, we're going to put a banner up this year. We're going to be champions. We're going to be champions against all odds. And we're going to be champions on and off the field. People are going to see us as champions. Now, I'm not sure I even believed what I was saying to these guys, because I'm looking at them going, man, there ain't much lacrosse talent there, except for my two sons. So all of a sudden, I've got to decide, so how do I get this vision across to them? It's got to be by story. So the story that came to mind was a story out of the Bible in the book of Judges. There's a young man by the name of Gideon. Just to give the historical context, Moses has taken Israel out of Egypt and brought them close to what is now Israel. Joshua eventually is the commander who brings them in. They're there. But after Joshua dies, there's a lot of problems. And one of the great enemies, the Midianites, keep harassing the Jewish people. And God calls to Gideon and says, I want you to beat the Midianites. Now, Gideon doesn't sort of see this to be his role. And he's pretty nervous about this because he's heard the Midianites are like locusts in the field when it comes to their army. Like there's tons of them. And their camels are like the sands of the seashore. Tons of them. But Gideon goes through some challenges and he finally realizes, I guess I'm going to have to do this. So he has 32,000 soldiers. And God says to Gideon, there's too many. Ask who wants to go and not fight, and they can go home. So 22,000 go home, and Gideon's now left with 10,000. He's getting more and more nervous. And then God says, no, there's still too many. So what I want you to do is I want you to take the army down by the water, and I want you to see how they drink the water. I want you to take the people who stay alert and lap the water like this and keep them, and the ones who bend down on all their knees and hands and are like drinking down that way, not alert, don't take them. Of course, Gideon is hoping that they all drink it the way where he gets to keep them, but they don't. Only 300 drink being alert. And God says, those are your guys. Gideon's like, what are you talking about? Like 300, I'm going against multitudes. But the plan was even more amazing, because the way Gideon did this is he told each of the 300 to get a trumpet and a pitcher and put a torch under the pitcher. He then broke them into 3 companies of 100 each. And he said, when I give the sound, I want you to shout, I want you to break the pitcher, and I want you to blow the trumpet. They're all thinking, man, this guy, what kind of commander do we have? But that's exactly what they did. And the Midianites were so confused that they actually attacked each other and destroyed themselves, and then the Jews went ahead and pursued. But it was 300 against the multitudes using very unique methods. I told my team, that's us. We don't have many. Like, we only have 28 guys. Most of the teams we're playing are going to have like 40. And we're not going to be able to do it the same way everyone else does. But remember what the vision is: victory. So we would win a championship. First Southern Maryland team ever to win a regional championship. First Southern Maryland team ever to go to the state championships. So we got that banner. And it was tied in with a story. Let me tell you on a personal level. Our 3rd oldest child, Andrew, got married just before Christmas to a young lady by the name of Kylie. And Andrew and Kylie asked me if I would talk at their wedding and say something. So I was thinking about, what's the main thing? What do I need to tell them? What's the vision I want to give to them as they go off in life together? I thought about words like love, friendship, companionship, partnership. Then I realized, no, the real vision that they need to have is based on one word. The word commitment. You're in it for the long haul. And you make the decision now, you're in it for the long haul. Now, I could have put up a PowerPoint at their wedding, but I didn't. Instead, I told them about Julius Caesar in 49 BC. Because in 49 BC, Julius Caesar was the governor of Gaul, which is present-day France and Belgium and some other spots. And he didn't like what he saw happening in Rome. So he made the decision that he had to attack. And there was a river. The name of the river was the Rubicon. It was on the north side of Italy. But there was a Roman law that any army that crossed the Rubicon would be liable to the full force of the Roman Empire. So when Julius Caesar approached that river, he realized this was it. Like, once I step across that river, I'm committed. There is no turning back. And when Julius Caesar made the decision to cross and continue, the whole history of the Roman Empire changed. But it came down to commitment. Stories and vision go together. We remember stories. We don't remember outlines. So how do we do this? Well, number one, you got to find stories. Find stories. If you're alert to finding stories, you will find them. They will find you. They're on the internet. They're in history books. They're in biography. There are allegorical stories that have been told for centuries that are great stories to use. I'll give you the name of a book, and I don't get any proceeds from this, but in the Marine Corps, we have a martial arts center of excellence because every single Marine is trained in martial arts. Their motto is, one mind, any weapon. I love it. One mind, any weapon. So they're training not only the physical capacity of the Marine, but the mental and spiritual capacity as well. And they do it through stories. Every time they teach a new move, they teach a story with it that reinforces what they're supposed to learn. And the deputy director of the Martial Arts Center he compiled a book of stories. It's called Tie-Ins, Tie-ins, Tie-Ins for Life, because that's what they call them. This is a tie-in to the move we've just done. And it has story after story, wonderful stories that cover all kinds of aspects of life. But find the stories. Then the second thing you have to do is you have to practice and rehearse the stories. to friends, to the mirror, doesn't matter. You've got to realize you're all natural storytellers. Go down to a playground where there's a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds. Are they passing bullet points to each other? Like, hey, let me show you my newest PowerPoint. No, they're not. They're telling stories to each other. You were born to be a storyteller. It fits right in. And then you got to just do it. You just got to tell stories and try to keep thinking about, for this given situation, how do I tell a story? I tell people that prepare for interviews, forget all the lists of your strengths and all that stuff. Tell them stories about you. They're not going to remember all those individual, unique, no, they're going to remember stories. I remember this one midshipman who I just finished teaching about stories, and he's having to go before the superintendent because he was in a little bit of trouble. And as he got ready to go, I happened to meet him outside of the superintendent's office, and I said, "You all ready?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to tell them stories about why I should be here." I said, "Good for you." He came out. He was retained. He's now a first lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps and doing a great job. Stories. So, let me end with this, with a story. November 1918, World War I, the war's about to end. General John Lejeune is a division commander for the U.S. forces in France. I don't know if you got a tour of the Naval Academy, but there's a little statue of John Lejeune that sits outside of Lejeune Hall that's named after him. He was the 13th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, highest ranking Marine, 13th one of the greatest of all times. I don't know if you saw the other two big statues. There's a big statue of Admiral Stockdale, love Admiral Stockdale. Big statue of Admiral Lawrence, I love Admiral Lawrence. But poor Lejeune, he's got like this little statue. I'm going to go one night and put in one of those pump-up things, so he can get a little bigger. Anyway, he's a division commander in World War I. Huge responsibility. The ceasefire is called. The war is over. The very next day, General Lejeune is visiting his field hospital. And as he's walking through the hospital, he sees a young Marine who has an amputated leg. He walks over to that Marine sergeant and he says, "Sergeant, what happened to you?" Sergeant said, "Sir, yesterday there was a bridge across the Meuse River, and my battalion was given the mission to take that bridge, and as I was crossing the bridge, artillery fire came in, small arms fire, cut into my leg in bad shape, and they brought me here to the field hospital last night, and they amputated my leg to save my life." General Lejeune said, "Did you say that occurred yesterday?" Sergeant said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Didn't you know that the war was going to end at any moment yesterday?" Sergeant said, "Well, yes, sir, that was common knowledge on the front." And Lejeune looked at that sergeant and he said, "So what induced you to go across that bridge knowing what you knew?" The sergeant, with tears in his eyes, looked back at General Lejeune and said, "Sir, Captain Dunbeck, our battalion commander, called us on the friendly side of the Meuse. He pointed to the bridge and he said, 'Men, I've been given the mission to secure that bridge, and I'm going across that bridge, and I expect you all to follow me.'" And then the sergeant looked again at General Lejeune and said, "Sir, what could we have done? We certainly weren't going to let the captain go across the bridge by himself. We loved him too much for that." After General Lejeune would tell that story, he would always say this: "I've always felt that the incident that I just narrated gives one a better understanding of the meaning and practice of leadership than all the books that have been written and all the speeches that have been made on the subject." That's always been striking to me. John Lejeune, one of the great leaders of the Marine Corps, said, "You want to know what leadership is about? It's about the love between a leader and those he or she leads, and the love between the followers and their leader." That's what leadership is about. And General Mattis, when he spoke at the Forrestal lecture, said, you do want to have the affection of your people. It's not a popularity contest, but you want the affection of your people. And the only way as a leader you will have the affection of your people is if you love them. And some of them are not going to be very easy to love. It doesn't matter. You're still responsible for loving them. So, have your vision, but create it with love. Tell your stories, but tell them with love. Lead, but lead with love. Because ultimately, that's the greatest vision, is to lead with love. I thank you for your attention. I thank you again because you care about leadership development. And I thank you because you can be one of those that John Gardner tried to develop over his entire lifetime, the next Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and the rest. And I'd be more than happy to entertain your questions up here at the microphone. You can ask me why I have 10 children. It's a long story, and I'm not going to tell you. But anything else is fair game. And I know there are buses and vans and airplanes and all kinds of things to catch, but I'd be more than happy to stick around to answer any questions you might have. Thanks. Thank you. All right, questions? That's right, you can just say it and I'll repeat it.
That was an outstanding brief, so thank you. As you know, in our line of work, my name is Mark Jabelli, I'm a midshipman at UT, University of Texas NROTC program. We have to give a lot of briefs and pass on a lot of information, and the reason we kind of rely on PowerPoints is that they're an easy way to get, just lots of data out. How do you best integrate, this idea of getting the vision across, even if it's just, for this PT evolution, we're going here, here, and here. How do you integrate stories in that to make them interesting and keep your audiences and your shipmates' attention?
Okay, so the question really is about, so does PowerPoint have any useful role out there? Like you're giving a battalion training brief. Can you just do it with stories? Probably not. So there's times where you do use PowerPoint, but I'll tell you one of the things you should always be thinking about is there a way to present this data in a more interesting way or a way that is going to grab people's attention? And I'll give you a website to go to. The website is www, I don't remember if his first name is on it or not. Try Edward, E-D-W-A-R-D, Tufte, T-U-F-T-E.com. If it doesn't have the Edward, just put in Tufte.com. I think it's edwardtufte.com. He's got a ton of articles, free articles on there that deal a lot with that issue of how do you make data interesting. He's got some books that are out that are very, very good. Let me just give you one particular example. I had this opportunity to be at NASA after the Challenger accident. So I became very attuned to NASA over the years, even though I didn't work for them again. You remember the Columbia accident? The Columbia accident is when a piece of foam came off the shuttle and hit into the fuel tank, or actually hit the wing surface, if I remember it. So they're up in space, and now they're trying to figure out if this is a problem or not. If you go to Tufte's website, find the PowerPoint that was used by a certain corporation that made the external fuel tank, and see how they presented the data. There's just tons of information on this slide. The main point of the slide was, what we've tested before to see if it's a problem is about that size. The size of what came off of the shuttle, the external fuel tank, is about the size of one of those large balls you kick around in the gym. If they had just brought those two in, here's a golf ball and here's one of these big balls, we tested this is what hit the shuttle, that would have caught people's attention. The data was hidden because there was just so much of it. So I would stick to as little as possible on a given slide. But there are times where you use PowerPoint. I mean, I use PowerPoint for those kinds of things. But I think it's a mindset. The mindset is there a better way to present this than just doing the typical way? One other story, and then I'll go to the next question. But Gardner, when he came and took over IBM a number of years ago, when IBM was down in the dumps, everyone came in with, at that time, you ever seen an overhead projector? You know those slides you put, I mean, I know you don't use that stuff anymore, but everyone came in with stacks of them. So the very first senior vice president who comes in to brief Gardner starts with the very first one. Gardner, the new CEO of IBM, gets up, comes over to the overhead projector, and shuts it off. And he says, have a seat. Tell me what's really going on in your area. Of course, that put a shockwave through IBM. Whatever you do, don't use any overhead transfer. Well, that wasn't his point. His point was, let's talk about this. So yes, PowerPoint has its place, but have a mindset to say, is there a better way to present the information? And Tufte's got some great stuff. Okay, I guess we keep going back and forth. Is there a reason why everyone stands like way back there and then comes to the mic? Like, I keep thinking about this. There's a medical thing now, you know, some where you have to stand way far away from someone who's getting a prescription. You don't have to do that. You can come down. Go ahead.
Sir, Midshipman, First Class Cruise. You cited some positive stories like Megan's Mocha and the story of Gideon, and you also cited some negative examples like Task Force Smith. Do you think one type is more effective than the other, and how do you choose what sort of story to use?
Yeah, the question is on stories, are positive stories better than negative stories? I think it depends on the situation, though I think people who actually study this in great detail would say that a positive story, if you can tell it, is always much better than the negative story. So if I had a choice, I would pick the positive one. When I took command of that unit, for some reason, Task Force Smith just immediately came to mind, and it seemed to fit pretty well of something we were trying to prevent. Now, by the way, in each of those scenarios, like when I had the unit, that's not like the only story I told. There were other ones, but that became kind of the anchor story. But in direct answer to your question, those that have a good outcome are normally better than ones that don't. Go ahead.
In the military, especially in the Navy, we really love our sea stories. And the world has thousands and thousands of stories that are created every day. How do you sift through and find the perfect thing to convey the message that you're looking for?
So again, the question is, hey, there's a lot of stories out there. How do you find the right one? I keep files of stories. And I'll read it, and I sort of just quickly evaluate, and probably some of that's experience. I just get a feel like, I'm not sure I'm gonna ever use that one. But if I'm not certain, I'll tear it out, I'll print it out, I'll write it out, whatever the case may be, and stick it in that file folder, looking for the right story for the right time. But again, I think if we're alert that we wanna find them, they will also find you, but I think you gotta store them somehow too, so that you can refer back to them, because you're not going to remember them all, or you're not going to remember them that well, and you're going to have to go back to that. But I think it is a sifting process of just saying, and you're going to connect with certain stories and not with other ones, and those are the ones you want to clip and save. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, good morning. My name is Adriana Martinez from Southern Methodist University. My question is about your final point regarding the love between a leader and those he or she leads. If I could ask you to further elaborate on your definition of love, and then also, you know, for those times when maybe you see a group that you lead fairly infrequently, once every couple weeks or so in you know, the typical meeting, how do you establish that loving relationship to make that a more effective team?
Okay, well, that's about a 2-hour presentation, and I actually have one that's called What's Love Got to Do with It? If you remember the song many years ago by Tina Turner, that gets at that very issue. Let me give a quick one at least. Number one, I believe that love is demonstrated by sacrifice. You can tell people you love them all day, but they want to see it in action. I tell my good wife every day that I love her, hopefully multiple times each day. That's not enough. There's got to be action that's shown. So thinking of love as a sort of a mushy feeling, no, it's action towards the people that you genuinely care about, but you genuinely care about their well-being, about how they're doing, about where they're heading, of how you can help. But ultimately, you gotta show it. You've got to demonstrate it. So I see love as very, very much a sacrificial type place. If you have infrequent contact, that's when you've got to make the effort to touch out as much as you possibly can. So that means if you're used to just having meetings, the question is, okay, I know George is a varsity soccer player, whatever the scenario is. I'm going to go see that person play soccer because that's their love. And then we'll have that short connection afterwards. That's probably even more important than these times that we actually have meetings. But love takes time. And so when I had a very large unit in multiple states, you got to travel, just like Jim Donald traveling 20 out of 30 days a month to reach the people, to make sure that they knew he cared about them. It was also mentioned, I don't remember what speaker, I think it was actually the Southwest Airlines Braniff guy. He talked about the handwritten notes. If you don't see him that often, write him a handwritten note. It'll have that kind of impact. But again, it's a pretty complex subject. I'll just warn all of you that when I say love your people, that doesn't mean on the first day on the job, or your first day on the ship, or your first day in the school, you bring everyone together. You say, no, everyone get real close. Come here, come here. I just want all of you to know I love you. I absolutely love you. Okay, now go back to work. Just remember, I love you. Has nothing to do with that. Has everything to do with action, sacrifice, and time.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, my name is Alex Martin. I'm from Marietta College, and I just want to thank you for being here today. But I guess mine has to do more with communication in general, because you kind of talked about getting a vision across through stories and emotion. But in this day and age, with all the social media and things, do you think that there's any validity in using that to get across the vision as well?
Oh, sure, sure. Because I actually was thinking about this last night. I didn't mention it today, though. My daughter and my son, my two daughters and son that I see here, I see how often they access Facebook. What is Facebook? Is Facebook a set of PowerPoints, a set of principles? It's mainly pictures, right? That's what attracts people to keep coming back to Facebook. Oh, I wonder what they're doing. It's all about story. So you can use something like Facebook with pictures to symbolize something that's very, very important to you. And that can be part of the communication. Again, it's not like we're walking around as leaders, all we're doing is telling stories. I think it's the foundation, but we build off of that, and yes, we do use social media. Admiral Jim Stavridis, who is over in the European Command right now, was one of the first high-ranking Navy officers to have his own Facebook, his own whatever, and he used that to touch people and make sure they know what he was thinking. But as a leader, you can use Facebook to tell stories. Hey, I just came back from whatever you posted, it's on, people read it, like it, and then it moves quite a ways. But I did think about Facebook last night, and I thought about what attracts people to keep coming back to it. And it really is more about relationships and stories than it is anything else. So yes, I would use that as, again, that's a whole nother presentation of how we can overdo electronics, but use it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm Isaac Inungarai from the University of Nebraska. I had the opportunity to intern at the Union Pacific headquarters in Omaha.
The railroad.
The railroad, so I knew the 4 feet and a half inches. But I got the opportunity to sit in a lot of the meetings between upper management personnel in the finance department, and it seems like it was everything in the meetings, all the material was very heavily data oriented.
Sure.
Lots of PowerPoints, and it almost seems like telling stories to them, to the CFO or whatever, it seemed like a waste of time to them. And I would just like your opinion on how you think you can change the corporate culture where this is prevalent in some areas.
So the question is, he went to a lot of finance meetings, and lo and behold, they used a lot of PowerPoint and had a lot of data. Welcome to the world of comptrollers and finances and the rest. Well, number one, you can change the culture if you're the head guy, like Gersten did at IBM. Hey, don't just give me a bunch of financial statistics. What's really happening? So that's one way. If you're at the bottom, you can't be dumb about this and kind of come in and go, oh, I know you were expecting, a chart that showed how I'm not going to do that for you today. Let me tell you a story. No, I think you start by combining the two. You start by still presenting the data that they're used to, but maybe putting it in a context where you use a story, or maybe use a symbol. See, symbols are very powerful as well, not just stories. I'll get back to the finance to finish up that question, but one of our sons who was a football player, they had this team that was also very undermanned, and their main story became the Spartans, the 300 standing in the gap. And every game they would bring out this Spartan helmet, and they'd put it out there, and that was the vision, the symbol. And they did extremely well. So again, I think sometimes just something physical could help break the ice to get it away from just PowerPoint. So I think you have to ease it in, and you can't be ignorant about how the system works. And honestly, the finance guys are some of the toughest because they are very data-driven. You want them to sort of be careful with their numbers, but when it comes to briefing other people, I think there are ways where you can make it a little bit more engaging with other people. So I think you got to do it gently from the bottom. From the top, you can be a little bit more aggressive.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I'll even take them from the audience, just you sitting there. You don't even have to come up to the microphone. Anything else about vision, leadership, stories? Okay. The name of the book is called Tie-Ins, Tie-ins, for Life. I'll throw out one other book suggestion before I go, and it's called The Story Factor. The Story Factor. I can't remember the name of the author, honestly, but it has a chapter that actually you don't even have to buy the book, because if you go to Google and put in the 6 stories you should be able to tell, you can find a free access to just this one chapter on the 6 stories that every leader should be able to tell. Who am I? Why am I here? Where are we going? And it's got 3 others. And the interesting thing about that Story Factor book is the author says you can't even get to the vision until you've been able to tell a story about who you are and why you're there. Because people tend to mistrust leaders. They're just not so sure, like, is this really about you? And you've got to convince them it's not about you. And one of the ways you convince them is it really isn't about you. Because you can't get going back to love. You can't really love people if it's all about you. It's all about your promotion, all your awards, all your recognition, all the credit, all the spotlight. Forget it. And there's a ton of leaders out there that lead that way. Don't be one of them. All right, well, thank you very much. Do you have a question, sir?
Probably embarrass myself, but I think that most everybody in the group is going to have to go back to their unit and tell a story. And I'm not in that position. I'm too old for that sort of thing. Each person's probably in their own mind, you know, I got to go back, I got to talk to my group, and I'm going to have to tell them some stories. Well, certainly, just talking about general practice, you can make a story about that, but maybe you had some other suggestions to help people crush this urge.
So the question is what if you got to go back, which you are going to have to, and you're faced with your group, and you got to tell them a story maybe about what you did here. But that's the key. Find a story that ties in to what you really learned here. Don't just give them 5 things you learned here. Say, this is the main thing I learned. And maybe there's a story that surrounds it. Maybe it is sunshine going to the sidelines and realizing the main thing I learned at this leadership conference was I've got to be willing to listen to everybody. That theme was mentioned a lot during this last couple of days. So instead of saying, I learned I should always listen to everybody, don't tell them that. Tell them the sunshine story. So again, it's a mindset of, is there a way I can take the information I want to present and put it in the form of a story? And the more you read how others do it really, really well, I mean, Abraham Lincoln, storyteller, humor, Ronald Reagan, Martin Luther King, all those folks had that unique ability to do it. See how they did it and continue to work in that direction. So rather than, like if you're at a school where they said, hey, you got to give a brief here, after you come back from the leadership conference, we'll go to the Naval Academy, so give us a brief. Risk it. Don't have a PowerPoint. Tell them a story. Here's someone I met. Let me tell you about that person and how that person influenced my thinking about leadership. Again, it's a mindset more than anything else. but I'll come back to that last one. Vision, stories, delegation, whatever it is, do it with love. And you can't love if it's about you. So don't let it be about you. God bless you and thanks.